Hey, what's up guys? Thomas here, and we're going to be painting this amazing landscape in Midway, Utah. It's been really fun driving out here and just looking at all the hikes and trails, so I'm excited. Let's get started. In every image I make, I'm extremely conscious of light and shadow. This is the basis for how I interpret the world around me. And I try to keep my lights and darks separated and designed so that the image is super clear. This is something I mention in almost every video because it's important to making a clear image. During daylight hours, the sun is such a powerful light source and it creates such a sense of light direction that I'm looking to keep it consistent in my own painting. In this case, the sun is on the left side of the landscape, casting shadows slightly towards the viewer. Not quite backlit, but the sun is behind the objects in my landscape. So any surface facing towards the sun is going to catch light, and anything facing away will fall into shadow. Pretty simple, right? Since Midway was pretty green at this time of year, I'm also going to try to separate my greens in the same way I separate my light and dark. Warm for the light, and cool for the shadow. Since I'm using watercolor as my medium, I'm working light to dark, starting with my warm greens by mixing orange and yellow into the green to pump up the color temperature. For the clouds, I'm using the white of the paper for the light side and painting the negative shape of the sky with a pointed tip brush to create wispier clouds, so they have movement since it was a windy day. After putting all the lights in, I start placing shadows by making sure to look, observe, and then place the shadows according to the light direction. You can load your brush with pigment for more saturated color and wash it out by adding more water to create a gradient. If there's too much water in the brush stroke, I'll dab the paper towel to dry it. I'm working background to foreground, and as I come closer and closer to the viewer, I'm adding more and more detail. For the midground, this means starting to break the transition of shadow to light into more complex shapes using small brush strokes to indicate the masses of trees in the distance. Basically, I'm trying to simplify them to their most basic shapes and paint them as a group, not individually. I'm also working general to specific throughout the entire painting, painting larger shapes with big brush strokes with a flat brush, moving to smaller brushes the more detail I get into. For the trees, I'm using a cool down green, then adding water to that same cool green and applying it lightly over the warm grass to create the shadows coming towards the viewer. I have a few pointed brushes to paint with. Less water gives me a tighter line for edge control. For example, I'll use that in the trees. But for looser areas like the water reflections of the lake, I'll load the brush with water to allow edges to go softer. You can see I'll pay more attention to the shadows in the midground tree, particularly the one in the center, since all the mountains are pointing at it compositionally. The approach of separating light and shadow creates a clear image and streamlines the process of thinking. Even if your colors are off, if the values are grouped light side and shadow side, and if you keep them separated, your image will read. Lastly, I'll put a few long controlled lines down for the plants at the edge of the lake and bump the saturation of the grass in the foreground by putting a second, more vibrant yellow on the light side after the first pass is dried. This creates a doubling up effect and essentially allows me to make a color more vibrant. You can do this with any watercolor technique, essentially layering one color on top of another to make it either more vibrant or give it an interesting color mix between two different colors. This was part one of a two-part landscape painting demo, and in part two, I'll be talking about color and mixing, but I felt it was important to talk about light and shadow because they're the basis and foundation for all the knowledge I have in color mixing. Thanks for joining me, and if you guys have any tips or tricks of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.